As I was thinking about introducing Tracy Porteous to you, I thought about the fact that in this 500 people event, if there's one person that connects all of us to each other across the province, it's Tracy. With her focus on building bridges across people and across sectors to end gender-based violence. Tracy is the founding executive director of Ending Violence Association of British Columbia, a dynamic solution-based provincial association that trains and supports over 300 anti-violence programs and cross-sector initiatives across BC that respond to sexual, domestic violence, child abuse, criminal harassment, and sexual harassment. Tracy is the founding co-chair of Ending Violence Association of Canada, a national NGO whose main purpose is to educate and respond to issues related to gender-based violence at the national level. Tracy is the founder of the award-winning Be More Than a Bystander program that works to train men and boys to speak up about gender-based violence in communities and in workplaces. For nearly 40 years of commitment to ending gender-based violence, Tracy has provided advice and analysis to all levels of government across Canada and has been called on to meet with the delegations of governments across the world, including Paraguay, China, Japan, Mongolia, New Zealand, Ireland, and Denmark. Tracy has been seen and heard in the media as a spokesperson for all forms of gender-based violence. Recipient of many awards and recognition of her work, last summer, Tracy was bestowed the honor of an honorary Doctor of Law from the University of British Columbia and inducted into the Order of BC. I could go on, but I'm going to turn it over to Tracy. Tracy, please join us to give your keynote address.
Tracy, can you just unmute yourself, please?
Such a common experience on Zoom these days. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Ninu, for such a beautiful introduction. And as I was saying to myself, it's very meaningful to me to be giving a keynote today on the topic of sexualized violence in the province of British Columbia. But before I begin, I want also to extend my respect and thanks to the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples for allowing us to live and work on their beautiful ancestral and unceded territory. This place and the whole west coast of this country, from north to south, to east to west, holds much medicine. So I think for this topic, that the ongoing sexualized violence perpetrated against far too many, which is our topic today, I hope that everyone here will avail yourself to whatever is your medicine. I know joining us today, there are AFOT people, that is Aboriginal Focusing Oriented Therapy Healers, who traveled with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Commission across the country to provide healing to those who were giving testimony, and who use cedar and other medicines to help those traumatized through difficult times. I know joining us today are also STV counselors who use many other methodologies to help survivors find ways to talk about and process and heal from this trauma. I know there are also sexual violence response advocates and other Indigenous leaders and queer and trans and gender non-binary leaders, allies and supporters of sex workers and those who live with disabilities, and leaders who are racialized, and allies from police services, child protection, policymakers, and academics. And among us here today are also survivors, many of them us, and family members and loved ones of survivors. We are the system of response to sexualized violence in BC. And I want to both acknowledge how difficult it is to hear about this particular trauma. Sorry, it's very meaningful to me. day after day, but also I want to acknowledge what a gift it is to stand witness to the strength of the human spirit. I offer you all my profound respect and for carrying on in these most troubling times. It is my plan today to speak to the dire need for British Columbia to put in place a provincial sexual assault policy and to develop and mandate training for all responders and to speak to the great restart this government is making to put back services in place for survivors that were once cut. It is my belief that everything flows from policy and that because we have no policy in the area of sexual assault in this province, successive governments over the last 25 years have left a massive, serious, and harmful hole in the safety of women and girls, two-spirit and gender non-binary people in our province. It is my hope that I will outline today why we need such a policy and that you will join EVA BC in calling for action so we don't continue to stand by when countless survivors continue to be harmed by the trauma of sexual violence, and then by a system of response that is not being supported to really understand the gravity of these injuries. But before I get going with that, I want to pause for a moment and have a video to visit some history for us.
1 in 10 husbands beat their wives regularly, and these women, I don't think this is a very much of a laughing matter, Madam Speaker.
I was absolutely shocked, not that they laughed at me so much. I mean, as a novice MP, you sort of might expect that, but that they laughed at the whole very, very serious social problem of the high incidence of women that were battered by their spouses.
Margaret Mitchell is the longest sitting woman in the House. She regards that incident in 1982 as a watershed event, one that awakened the consciousness of Canada. The next day, the House apologized to Mitchell and to the women of the country.
I do find, though, that there's a very patronizing attitude still, and Mr. Kempling himself, for instance, calls me dear all the time. And that's, to me, is almost as bad as the kind of overt sexist comment that he made this week.
So as we could see, in 1982, the BC NDP Member of Parliament, Margaret Mitchell, introduced a significant report about intimate partner violence to the House of Commons. She was met with laughter. This was a galvanizing watershed moment for spouse assault in Canada, galvanizing because what happened on that day was a national embarrassment. In that same year, and I think because of what happened in the House of Commons, the Federal Solicitor General issued a directive instructing the RCMP to recommend charges be laid in all cases of spouse assault wherever there was reasonable and probable grounds. And later that same year, the Federal Justice Minister encouraged all provinces and territories to be more proactive about spouse assault and to put in place programs to encourage more women to report. By 1985, some form of spouse assault policy was in place in most of the country. And since that time, there's been a cascade of legislation and policy and programs and training and protocols developed to assist women and their families struggling with the results of intimate partner violence. The same cannot be said for sexual assault. In the 1970s, important works began to take place, which resulted in vital changes to the criminal code. At the same time, sexual assault centers began to be created by groups of concerned feminists, but unlike domestic violence, sexual assault has remained almost invisible on the social policy front here in BC. And I think not by any one person's doing, but because sexual violence remains to this day uncomfortable and frightening for many people to talk about. And we've been socialized into believing all kinds of harmful myths that populate the minds of responders, our courts, and even our legislators. With the exception of pockets here and there, we have not yet supplied our justice, health, and social service systems with the policy, training, tools, and resources they need to respond to disclosures with confidence, with competence, with compassion, and sophistication. The flow of funding to support survivors has been woefully inadequate. Between the late 1970s and 1992, BC had just 6 funded specialized programs known as sexual assault centers. In 1992, the newly elected NDP government then oversaw the building of 17 more specialized sexual assault response programs, among many other important things they did. In the 8 years this government was in power then, EVA BC was also funded to build program standards for the provision of support to survivors. We were successful in ensuring that survivors had access to forensic medical exams, even if they were undecided about reporting to the police. We co-built and delivered a 9-day core training for responders to sexual assault for BC's sexual assault centers and community-based victim assistance programs. At the same time, BC Women's Hospital was busy creating sexual assault examiner training for doctors and nurses and helping to build best practices and response programs at hospitals across the province. And later, BCIT built a forensic nursing training course. And also during this time in the 1990s, this same NDP government made public commitments to put in place 3 important provincial policies that would guide the cross-sector response to what was then called power-based crimes: domestic violence, child abuse, and sexual assault. They got the child abuse policy done. The VAWARE policy was also completed. And for 5 years, EVA BC was part of a cross-ministry, cross-sector committee to build a provincial sexual assault policy. I'm not really sure what took so long, but the upside was it was all but finished. We were working out some issues related to whether or not it was agreeable for BC to become one of only 2 provinces in Canada to provide sex offenders with diversion. This is what can happen when you have leadership that is committed to ensure no one is left behind. The domestic violence and child abuse policy resulted in many spin-offs, cross-sector policies and best practices for RCMP and municipal police, Crown and child protection and corrections. These policies have us all using the same risk assessment measures. They have resulted in mandatory training for every single police person in BC, from the newest recruit to the commissioner of E Division, has had to take training on domestic violence. Every child protection worker in the province is provided with training about domestic violence. These policies have resulted in specialized police positions, domestic violence units, ICATs, specialized child protection teams, and child advocacy centers. These policies have even resulted in specialized funding for research in the area of what is working to increase safety and to decrease risk. And I know that we're not there yet in terms of domestic violence and child abuse, because it's still happening at alarming rates. And certainly this is more true than ever during COVID. But almost every initiative we have in our province that is focused on increasing safety came as a result of these 2 policies: the VAWARE policy for domestic violence and the child abuse policy. For 25 years, EVA has not stopped in our knowledge and our push for getting that sexual assault policy done, which we think will bring about important safety and informed responses. So just a few more notes about our history. Just before the sexual assault policy could be completed, a provincial election took place and a new administration took power. Without much delay, we saw the dismantling of what we had started. The 5-year cross-ministry, cross-sector policy was shelved, and following that were devastating cuts of all the funding to all BC's sexual assault centers. And I think that's because if you don't have policy, why do you need programs? And I say that somewhat sarcastically. Funding for training community-based advocates was also cut, and slowly over time, the funding that BC Women's Hospital had to develop hospital-based responses to sexual assault was also cut. We never did get to the place of building equivalent mandatory training for police and child protection, for Crown and anti-violence, as sexual assault simply disappeared from the government's priority, their concern, and their agenda, despite our ongoing attempts. In 2005, the then Liberal Premier Campbell held a forum on the topic of public safety. At this forum, E Division RCMP reported to those attending that if you are a sex offender in the province of BC right now, you have a 98.5% chance of getting away with it. So what was done in response? Nothing. Well, almost nothing until recently, and I'm going to come back to this. But on the topic of sex offenders having a 98.5% chance of getting away with it, I think very little is known about sexual predation. And why is that? Because we have no policy. Nobody's asking questions. There are few people trying to figure out what we do about the fact that only 5% of survivors have enough faith in the justice system to report, and yet sex offenders carry on almost unfettered in their predation. Holly Johnson, a colleague from Ottawa and recently retired academic and previous head of Statistics Canada initiatives related to sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence, said in 2020, confidence in Canada's criminal justice system among victims of sexual assault is demonstrably at an all-time low. Just 5% of sexual assaults are reported to the police, and in contrast to other violent crimes, sexual assault rates have not declined. It stands to reason that sexually violent men who are not held to account are free to target other women. She says clearly, significant transformative change is long overdue. Many argue that it is not uncommon for sex offenders to be serial in their behavior, that many deliberately target vulnerable women or use extensive planning, often alcohol and other drugs, to render their victims vulnerable, and many rely on minimal force to threaten and intimidate. They benefit clearly from the low odds of detection because so few survivors report. Sexual assault, therefore, from a policy perspective, should be primarily understood as a serial phenomenon. This understanding should be more thoroughly and systematically integrated into the criminal justice system responses, particularly police investigations. 2 studies in the US found that serial sex offenders accounted for more than 90% of the sex assaults committed by participants in that research. So if 90% of sexual assaults are committed by serial offenders, then each report is an opportunity to investigate a series of offenses, not just one. I also think if more survivors knew that they were likely being preyed upon and manipulated by a repeat serial predator who planned out his crime, more survivors would likely tell someone about what happened, which then has the potential to create a pathway to healing. Our justice system has a tendency to allow sexual assaults at the front end of the career of a predator to go without consequence, because policies such as diversion and alternative measures aren't really yet alive to the reality of this repeat phenomenon, and the reality that uninterrupted sexual predation often leads to escalated violence. This lenient practice of tolerance and no consequence at the front end of the career of a sex offender can have tragic consequences. Serious sexual predators are not simply born. They are empowered when we don't intervene. They are encouraged when we have ineffective tools and policy to apprehend them and provide treatment to them. And they are made into opportunists when we don't find ways for survivors to disclose that are welcoming, informed, safe, and empowering. Just by way of example, offenders that were charged with the murders of Taylor Van Diest in Armstrong, BC many years ago, and Taisha Jones in Duncan, BC, and Lauren Leslie of Fraser Lake, just to name a few, all young girls. Their offenders were later found to have been arrested for lower end sexual assaults earlier in life and let go without consequence. Where does that leave public safety? And even what favors are we doing for those committing these crimes to leave them unchecked and untreated for their whole lives? We need to think about the no consequence approach, as the evidence suggests that the first time a predator is caught is highly unlikely to be the first time that they have offended. I also think our entire society and the systems that oversee and support us have yet to be able to fully understand the wholly dehumanizing and soul-level humiliating impact of sexual victimization. I think this is one of the important keys to understanding why survivors don't report. Sexual assault is challenging for those with no special training. Our previous longtime legal analyst, Gisela Rubsat, once wrote that traditional criminal justice benchmarks that help determine what makes an offense serious, such as the extent of obvious physical injury or financial loss, are not always clear in cases of sexual assault. A sexual assault survivor's physical injuries may or may not be significant or visible, but the unseen psychological injuries will be severe. A survivor's long-term ability to feel safe in the world, be intimate again, have relationships at all, find enjoyment in life, concentrate, earn an income, trust herself or the world around her, all basic human rights and constitutional liberties that most people take for granted. These may be seriously affected by this crime, but yet may not be obvious at the time of initial disclosure, nor may be possible to prove, let alone articulate to friends and family or responders. Having the ability to compassionately and appropriately respond to disclosures requires all of those in positions of receiving disclosures to have training, and not just advocates and justice system personnel, but high school teachers, university and college professors, resident advisors, child protection workers, band social workers, English language teachers, to name a few. A cross-ministry, cross-sector policy would call for this. If it is truly our collective intention to encourage more survivors to come forward in order that more survivors get the psychological assistance and care they need and deserve, and so that the potential lifelong effects can be mitigated, then we need to make sure that all professionals across the human services field have competence and sexual violence related trauma literacy. The latest research suggests that those who are within the most vulnerable group of sexual assault, women between the ages of 14 and 24, close to 90% will disclose to their friends. Also important, in the 1970s, I know that's a long time ago, two women researchers, Burgess and Holstrom, identified what is known as the rape trauma syndrome. We owe great thanks to them because of the great work they did on trauma-informed counseling and practice, and those theories stand strong today. And among their significant discoveries that still hold true is the fact that the first person a survivor discloses to and the response that she gets will make a difference between whether she tells anyone else and how she does with this trauma experience for the rest of her life. But if we don't have policy, and said policy is not mandating training for all responders, then how can we expect a trauma-informed response? We know much more today about trauma and the real impacts on the brain and the body, but this knowledge must become much more widespread. And at the very least, it must be basic core training to those whose jobs it is to respond to sexual assault. And it's not right now. Basic knowledge that all responders should have involve the fact that during a sexual assault, like any life-threatening attack, most victims experience a cascade or a flooding of cortisol and other stress hormones. This can cause partial or total immobility, temporarily paralyzing a person, freezing our brains and our bodies. Some survivors talk about the perception or the reality of feeling trapped, and this entrapment is increased by prior victimization. This occurs towards the end of the defense cascade when fight or flight responses have not been successful. Our heart rate drops, our physical immobility sets in, our vocal ability is suppressed, our limbs don't move easily. So running and fighting is difficult, yet that's the first thing that most survivors are asked is, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you communicate your no? The evidence suggests that these symptoms are found in more than 1/3 of rape survivors and more than half of child sexual abuse survivors. And so running and fighting or gouging someone's eyes out, as is taught in self-defense courses, does not come easily. Not with all of this cortisol and stress hormone flooding going on, and also not when most sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone who has ingratiated himself to the survivor in some way, someone the victim knows, someone she's trusted. Self-defense courses are good ideas, don't get me wrong. We need anyone that is being attacked to be conscious enough to fight the cascade of the flooding of the stress hormones. And we need to be alive to the weight of our socialization that tells us not to cause a scene and to feel empowered enough to physically fight back. But more than anything, we need police and Crown and healthcare and others to understand there are very complex neurobiological responses to trauma, to the trauma of sexual assault. And no longer should anyone be doubting a victim's narrative because they, the responder, don't understand this science or has no training. I would go as far as to say that I think it's unconscionable that we really have nothing in place to prevent secondary injuries to survivors by untrained professionals. By way of example, I have permission from an awesome young woman that I've had the honor of getting to know in the last couple of years, who was treated so badly by an untrained yet seasoned police officer that I find it inspiring that she has found not only a way to survive, but to overcome how she was treated. In fact, she had the wherewithal to make a complaint to the Police Complaints Commissioner last year because somehow she knew that she was not to blame, that the things that were being said to her by this police officer were out of some horror movie, and that she wanted to do what she could to protect other survivors from what she endured. Among the shocking displays of careless disregard and unconscious bias from the head of the investigation, this police officer said to her, after she was left in a field, unconscious, naked, and alone in the freezing dark of a January night, after having been sexually assaulted, where had her father not found her because her mother had tracked the whereabouts of her cell phone, she may not have survived. This police person actually said to her that perhaps she stayed out in the park and didn't come back to the party because she wanted to avoid the walk of shame. This same public safety officer also said to her he needed to be careful as he didn't want to impact the reputation of the poor young man that has been accused because he had a reputation to uphold. I say, good God, this to a young woman who had been left out in the temperature of 1 degree. Had her dad not found her, she might not be with us. And this young woman, an international level athlete and a grade A student, what of her reputation? What of her well-being? We are lucky as she is, we are lucky that she is resilient as she is and strong. And she knew that how she was being treated by this officer was appalling. I sing her praises as she came forward to make a complaint about this police person as she kept thinking about all the other survivors who are being harmed in similar ways. And I will say this too, I think we are letting responders down as well. Not that there's any excuse in the world for the blatant disregard of this particular officer towards this particular survivor, but I think that most people don't go to work wanting to do a bad job. But when we provide no training, we have no policy, we have no direction, we have no best practices, we have no accountability. We don't even ensure that investigations have supervisor sign off as they do in domestic violence cases. We have zero built-in oversights to our systems. What do we expect? There are numerous stories like this one, too many to narrate, like the young Indigenous woman who reported to the police in Kelowna, only to be asked if maybe she liked it, just a little, the rape that is. Or the Supreme Court of Canada case that EVA BC and EVA Canada intervened upon, where the courts were discussing the case of a 15-year-old girl who was already pregnant by her boyfriend when she was raped by her cousin. So the discussion was whether or not she could be believed. And why is that? Because she had sex before? And it's not just police. Our RCY published a report of the very high numbers of youth in care who've been sexually assaulted in BC, and where it appears that child protection workers are not deeming these traumatic incidents, each one of them, as injuries. So again, well-intentioned people with no training, no guidelines, no oversight, and no accountability. A few centuries ago, a fellow by the name of Edmund Burke once said, "All that is required for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing." We have so much to do in order not to stand by to witness the harms being carried on. Sexual assault is an urgent safety issue for women and girls, two-spirit, trans, and gender non-binary people, and for boys too. This public safety issue has been seriously neglected by all of our systems. Given the enormous prevalence of sexual assault in our country, its low reporting rate, yet increasing numbers, its serious long-term and often lethal impacts on survivors, the need for more effective responses is urgent. Feminists running BC's community-based anti-violence services have been doing Herculean work, ever increasing their sophistication and responding to increasing levels of violence and complex trauma with little to no funding. EVA BC has been applying for funding wherever we can to ensure community-based service providers have the training and the best practices they need in order to respond. Some days I feel like it's almost come to running bake sales to do what we can to ensure that those on the front lines have what they need. But we cannot feel complacent about the whole filled patchwork of responses we have. Many people and some offices and departments are doing what they can with what they have. I know that there are some municipal police departments like VPD that have been making sure their sex crimes units have training on the neurobiology of trauma and how to conduct trauma-informed sexual assault investigations. Very recently, MPSSG, the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General and the Department of Justice funded the development of a trauma-informed practice training for the entire criminal justice system with the help of EVA BC and many other partners. But for the most part, this TIP training cannot be seen as a stand-in for the needed training focused specifically on sexual assault. The BC Green Party introduced a private members bill to ensure all post-secondary institutions have standalone sexual assault policy. And that was followed by the then NDP Minister of Advanced Education province-wide campus sexual consent campaign. We now have rental protections for sexual assault survivors and paid leave for sexual assault survivors. These newish pieces of legislation were only going to be for those fleeing domestic violence, but EVA BC inserted ourselves and convinced the powers that be that they needed to include protections and supports for sexual assault survivors as well. But most importantly, it still feels like we're having to fight at every turn. We don't want to fight. We shouldn't need to fight for the basic human rights of survivors not to be harmed by the very systems in place for public safety, for child protection, and healthcare. Training for police and Crown and corrections, the judiciary is still absent. Even training for general practice physicians, ER nurses, lawyers, social workers, and human service professionals across all the fields. I think facing us right now today is the greatest responsibility and opportunity that we have ever had to capitalize on the groundswell of what feels like a growing window for social and policy change. The resurgence of the Me Too movement has more survivors coming forward every day, whether they be Indigenous survivors, survivors who work in film and television, survivors in the hospitality industry, survivors who are athletes in sport, RCMP survivors, survivors in the Canadian military. At every turn, people are saying enough is enough. It is time we put legislation, policy, practice, and civilian oversight in place to stop this sexualized, violent free-for-all. Last year, the NDP government in BC started to move in this direction. They allotted EVA BC $10 million so that we could provide grants to communities to provide services to sexual assault survivors once again. That resulted in 23 new services that are getting on stream now, and I can't thank this government enough. It's an awesome start, but we can't be complacent. I was impressed to see the mandate letters of both our Solicitor General and Parliamentary Secretary of Gender Equality that state a direction from the Premier to put in place funding for BC sexual assault centers. These mandate letters also call for them both to oversee the building of policy for police and standards for police in responding to sexual assault. They also call for a BC to be part of the National Gender-Based Violence Action Plan. So while I say bravo to this direction, it's also not enough. I would like to take a moment to speak directly to three people who have the power to direct their ministries and their government to get this provincial policy done. Mike Farnworth, the Solicitor General of BC, Adrian Dix, the Minister of Health of BC, and John Horgan, the Premier of BC. We all have things in common. All of us have spent our lives in public service in this province. All of us care deeply about social justice, healthcare, and gender equality for all British Columbians. Let's get this done while you are still there, before you retire from political life, and while you have the platform to make good on your 1990s promises. Those who continue to be hurt every day by sexual violence are depending on you. Yes, it is hard to talk about, uncomfortable to be associated with sexual assault, but if you're not going to do it, who will? A policy could ensure that there's health care for survivors in every community across BC. A policy can ensure we provide independent legal advice, as EVA has tested and other provinces has started to provide. A policy could ensure that unfounded cases of sexual assault, that police classified cases of unfounded sexual assaults begin to be reviewed in this province. My colleagues across the country are working with their police counterparts, and even during COVID, have been doing case reviews throughout this last year. BC has made promises and not begun. The federal government provided the RCMP with $10 million to begin the process of reviewing cases, because we know that without training, mistakes have been made. With a policy and a mandate for services, we could see more survivors getting help, more survivors coming forward. We could see more services being provided by and for Indigenous women. We can see more services being provided for sex workers, racialized survivors, BIPOC survivors, for and by. A policy would outline the need for training and subsector policy and best practices. We could set in place oversight mechanisms, reporting and accountability. And more than anything else, we could change the direction of sexual assault in this province. We need to increase the numbers of survivors that come forward to get help, and there needs to be places for them to land. So Premier, Minister of Health, and Solicitor General, you have it within your power to make a change in this province for the better, and to make a statement, a bold statement, that you're not going to leave survivors of sexual assault behind. We are committed to working with you, and we're not going to stop until it's done. Thank you very much.
Wow, Tracy, thank you so much. You know, I don't even have words. You have such a thorough analysis. Your years of advocacy and understanding of these issues at such a deep level. And all of us across the province have counted on you and trusted you and have been impressed by you, who has been delivering this message, who has carried this message over the years, and to be in this moment in history when you provide this keynote address to us, to compile all of that and call out our friends in the government. They're our allies. We work with them on these issues, and we stand with you on echoing that message to the province. Tracy, there's not enough I could say to acknowledge the work that you have done. But again, I think you can imagine virtually, once again, over 500 participants in this forum raising their hands to you. So allow me on their behalf to thank you for the keynote address.